On July 29, 1876, Elizabeth Custer requested to meet with the widows and children of the soldiers who died at the Battle of Little Bighorn. She found it difficult to keep her composure as she waited for everyone to gather on the steps of her home. The sound of children laughing and talking momentarily distracted her from her own grief. She welcomed the children and their mothers with a smile as they slowly arrived. Once everyone was assembled, she expressed her gratitude for their friendship and loyalty and wished them well in their future lives beyond Fort Abraham Lincoln. Before they left, she gave each child a picture of General Custer. The following morning, Elizabeth Custer, Maggie Custer Calhoun, Nettie Bowen Smith, Annie Yates with her 3 children, 3.5-year-old George, 22-month-old Bessie, and 7-month-old Milner, along with Annie's brother Richard Roberts, a civilian herder and part-time newspaper correspondent, and David Reed, Elizabeth's brother-in-law and father of Henry Reed, traveled to Bismarck, Dakota Territory by carriage and steamboat. All the women were dressed in black, and all but Elizabeth were seen crying as the steamboat carried the sorrowful group down the river. In Bismarck, they were met by Colonel J.W. Raymond and stayed overnight at his home. They set out on the arduous trek back to Monroe early the following morning in a special train car. Newspapers all over the nation published in-depth articles about the journeys of these widows, who were nicknamed the Widowed Ones by the editor of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Reporters, eager to catch a glimpse of the sorrowful women, especially Elizabeth, gathered at the train's first stop in St. Paul. They noted being able to see the widows through the train's windows. According to an article in the Findlay Jeffersonian from August 4, 1876, it is a heartbreaking sight. It is now thought that Mrs. Custer will not long survive her husband. Given how bad her situation is, there's always a chance that she won't survive. The bullet that killed his devoted wife was also the one that pierced the valiant Custer. Before the train departed from St. Paul the following day, another passenger boarded. H.A. Town, the superintendent of the Northern Pacific Railroad, which provided the special car for the widows, had asked Reverend Richard Wainwright to accompany them and provide any necessary consolation. Maggie Calhoun, in particular, was overcome with grief, and nothing anyone did could ease her sorrow. It was agreed that Reverend Wainwright would travel with the group until they arrived at their destination. There was a sizable, polite throng waiting when the train pulled into Fargo, where the passengers were to depart for the evening. The crowd remained quiet as the widows stepped off the train and walked past the solemn onlookers. Women and children bowed their heads and men took off their hats. Stooped over and ashen-faced, Elizabeth led the way, moving slowly as though the weight of her overwhelming sadness was almost too much to bear. As the last of the widows passed by, several townspeople could be heard crying. Even the men were moved to tears, wiping their eyes with handkerchiefs or backhanding the tears streaming down their faces. From Fargo, the mourners boarded the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad to continue their journey into Illinois, arriving in Chicago on August 3rd. At the train station, they were greeted by Colonel William Moore, who escorted them to the Palmer House Hotel. General Phil Sheridan had ordered the colonel to welcome the widows to the city and offer any needed assistance. According to newspaper reports, with the exception of Annie Yates, the women were very much prostrated. Annie, needing to care for her 3 children, kept her composure. Porter Palmer, owner of the Palmer House, and his wife Bertha were deeply moved by the tragic events and the dignified manner in which the women carried themselves. The widows were invited into their private rooms and they declined to charge them for their stay. Additionally, the Palmers decided to start a fund to benefit the officers' wives, contributing the first $250 themselves. 5 days after departing Fort Abraham Lincoln, Elizabeth and the other widows arrived in Monroe. As Elizabeth stepped off the train, she could no longer contain her emotions and burst into tears. It might have been the relief of finally returning home after such unimaginable devastation, or perhaps the memories of lost loved ones in such a familiar place, or a combination of both. She had remained strong for the others, but in that moment, she could no longer hold back her feelings. The widows were met at the depot by Reverend Erasmus J. Boyd, a long-standing president of Monroe Seminary and former instructor of Elizabeth's. Upon seeing Reverend Boyd, Elizabeth threw herself into his arms, weeping uncontrollably before fainting. The Reverend and other church members revived her and then escorted her to the clergyman's carriage. Maggie followed Elizabeth off the train but was so overwhelmed with emotion that she couldn't descend the steps on her own. David Reed and Richard Roberts assisted her to the Reverend's carriage, where she sat beside Elizabeth. Annie Yates, along with her children and Emma Reed, were the last to disembark. Nettie Smith remained on board, as her journey would not end until she reached her parents' home in Herkimer, New York. The widow's train stopped at the station in Monroe, and former First Lieutenant Frank Camageri was present. As a reporter for the Toledo Journal, he had been assigned to cover the arrival of the bereaved. In 1866, Camageri served with the 7th Cavalry under then-Lieutenant Colonel George Custer at Fort Riley, Kansas, where he met and grew fond of both Mr. and Mrs. Custer. Tasked with interviewing the widows, Camageri, seeing Elizabeth's fragile state, refused to question her or any of the other grieving women. "I contented myself with the barren formality of a card par condolence," he was quoted as saying in the August 5, 1876 account. At General Custer's homestead, where the late Sabreur's mother and father had long maintained the home fire, are Mrs. Calhoun, the sister of General George A. and Colonel Tom Custer, and the widow of a third deceased hero, Lieutenant Calhoun. Mrs. Yates is the granddaughter of the late head Justice Gibson of Pennsylvania, and the widow of George A. Yates, who was killed in the June massacre while leading his company. W. Milner Roberts is the head engineer of the Northern Pacific Railway. She has chosen to make her home here to stay close to her fellow widows and has already rented a charming cottage on Monroe Street, across from David Reed's residence. In the days that followed their arrival in Monroe, the widows visited close friends and family, politely declining calls from strangers who felt compelled to offer their condolences. Elizabeth cautioned Annie and Maggie about talking to strangers pretending to care about their well-being, warning that some might be newspaper reporters trying to exploit their vulnerability to gather information about Custer's command. The press continued to suggest that General Custer's ego and recklessness contributed to the outcome at Little Bighorn, a rumor that deeply annoyed the widows. They found solace in reading the letters of condolence that kept coming in from across the country. Early in August, Elizabeth received a comforting letter from Custer's Civil War commander, Major General George B. McClellan. "As a man, I mourn the loss of your honorable husband, a good, unselfish, and devoted friend. I mourn the loss of one of the most magnificent symbols of the armed forces and the country, a brave and virtuous soldier, as a citizen and soldier. I cannot afford to lose a soldier and a citizen of that caliber at this point in my life. My wife and I extend our heartfelt sympathy. May God grant you the strength to bear your burden of sorrow and teach you to look forward with calm resignation to the day when He allows you to reunite with Him. Continually your true buddy, William McClellan." That he passed away as he had lived, a gallant gentleman and true hero, battling fearlessly to the last desperate odds, gives me some comfort, and I have no doubt that it does the same for you. Annie Yates's brother, George G. Roberts, wrote of his grief and his life at Fort Abraham Lincoln after Elizabeth and the other widows and children had left in a letter dated September 12, 1876. "My dear Mrs. Custer, Mrs. Godfrey will write to Annie today, so I will send a short note to you, my kind friend. You and all of the loved ones in Monroe are in my prayers and in my thoughts. I look forward to my visit. I hope to bring Annie much joy, but I cannot yet confirm if I can get a leave. No news to report. Haven't I mentioned the new clubhouse down the lane? It's almost finished. The weather has been dark, rainy, and unpleasant for over 10 days now, but I haven't let it dampen my spirits. How can I adequately express my gratitude from such a distance when I always carry a profound thankfulness in my heart for your care towards my sister? I pray Maggie is improving so that Annie can enjoy more of her company. Annie can share anything from my letter with you and Maggie. Larry Milnor is unwell. I hope he recovers soon. Sending regards to you and Miss Emma Reed. Send my regards to Annie and the kids and my love to Maggie. You are greatly missed. George Roberts." Elizabeth, Maggie, and Annie were in no condition to respond to any letters. They were devastated and lacked the energy to do much beyond getting through each day. Maggie's sorrow had taken a toll on her physical health. She suffered from migraines and vertigo, spending most of her time in a quiet, dark room, rarely leaving her bed. Annie kept herself occupied with her children and managing her household, though nights were particularly difficult. She would often imagine George calling out to her, she informed Elizabeth. Sleep eluded her, and when she did manage to sleep, she dreamt of being back at Fort Abraham Lincoln, awaiting her husband's return. Elizabeth transformed the room she stayed in at her in-laws' home into a memorial for Custer. His desk, adorned with his books, papers, and journal, was meticulously arranged just as it had been in their quarters at Fort Abraham Lincoln. Above the desk, she hung the mounted heads of the elk and deer Custer had hunted, alongside his favorite pictures. His uniforms were carefully placed in the wardrobe beside her dresses,